"The best gift would be if you left my life," my son said on his 40th birthday, looking me straight in the eye. I stood there in his fancy living room, holding the watch I'd saved 3 months to buy him, watching his friends smirk behind their wine glasses. The silence that followed felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. My heart cracked right there on his expensive marble floor. If you've ever been told you're unwanted by the person you love most, if you've ever felt like a burden to someone you'd die for, grab your coffee and settle in, friend. Because this old man's got a story that'll either break your heart or give you hope. Sometimes the cruelest words become the greatest gift, even when they don't feel like it at the time. And if you're here for stories about starting over when life knocks you down, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'm Harold, and this is Coffee with Grandpa, where we talk about the moments that change everything. Some stories hurt to tell, but they need telling anyway. This one taught me that sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. That birthday party became my funeral, the death of the father I used to be. But what happened next, what I built from the ashes of that rejection, that's where the real story begins. You see, when someone tells you to disappear, sometimes the best revenge is actually doing it. 5 years later, my boy learned that lesson the hard way. The watch is still sitting in my drawer, unwrapped. But I'm not the same broken man who brought it to that party. What I discovered after I took his advice and vanished completely, well, that changed everything for both of us. Sometimes the best gift really is learning to leave. I drove home that night in complete silence, not even turning on the radio. The 3-hour drive felt like a lifetime, every mile taking me further from the son I thought I knew. When I finally walked into my empty house, I looked around at all the family photos on the walls, pictures of Michael's childhood, graduations, achievements I'd been so proud of. They all felt like lies now. That's when I made the decision that would change both our lives forever. If he wanted me gone, then gone I would be, but not in the way he expected. I wasn't going to fade away quietly in the same town, becoming the embarrassing father he'd have to explain to his friends. No, I was going to disappear completely. Michael was everything to me after his mother died when he was 15. Cancer took my beautiful wife Martha in 6 brutal months, leaving me with a grieving teenager who blamed the world for his pain. I became his anchor, his cheerleader, his financial support, and his biggest believer, all rolled into one lost widower, trying to fill the shoes of 2 parents. I worked extra shifts at the accounting firm to pay for his college, his apartment, his car, his dreams. When he wanted to study business at an expensive private university, I took out a second mortgage without hesitation. When he needed money for his first apartment in Chicago, I sent it without asking questions. Every achievement of his felt like my achievement too. Those early years in Chicago, he'd call me every Sunday. We'd talk for hours about his job, his girlfriend, his plans for the future. I lived for those calls, counting down the days until I'd hear his voice again. When he got promoted to marketing manager, I was prouder than if I'd won the lottery myself. That's my boy, I'd tell everyone at the hardware store. The visits home became less frequent as his career took off. Holidays turned into quick overnight stays filled with phone calls about work. Wedding planning consumed a whole year where I barely heard from him except when he needed my help with payments. I paid for half his wedding without complaint, just happy to see him happy with Jennifer. When little Emma was born, I thought everything would change. I imagined being the grandfather who taught her to fish, who told her stories about her daddy as a little boy, who spoiled her rotten with candy and toys. For the first year, that's exactly what happened. Michael seemed softer, more appreciative of family, more like the boy I remembered. But success changed him. The bigger his salary got, the smaller I seemed to become in his eyes. Phone calls became texts. Visits became obligations. When I'd try to give advice about raising Emma, he'd cut me off with comments about different generations and outdated thinking. The man who used to ask my opinion about everything now acted like my words were an inconvenience. The final warning came at Christmas 2 years before that birthday disaster. I'd bought Emma an expensive dollhouse I'd seen her admiring in a catalog. Michael took me aside and said, "Dad, you don't need to try so hard. We're doing fine without the constant gifts and attention." That should have told me everything I needed to know about how he really saw me. The distance became obvious when Michael stopped inviting me to family events unless I asked directly. His work parties, Emma's school plays, neighborhood barbecues, I'd hear about them afterwards through casual mentions, like I was an afterthought who wouldn't be interested anyway. When I'd express hurt about being left out, he'd make excuses about forgetting or not wanting to overwhelm me. Jennifer started answering my calls instead of Michael, her voice always polite but strained. "He's in meetings" became the standard response, even on weekends. When I'd ask about visiting, she'd mention how busy they were, how Emma had activities, how they were planning trips that somehow never included grandfather. The message was clear. I was becoming a burden they tolerated rather than welcomed. The breaking point started building when I suggested Emma spend a week with me during summer vacation. I'd planned fishing trips, museum visits, all the grandfather-granddaughter activities I'd been dreaming about since she was born. Michael's response crushed me. "Dad, she's got camps and friends here. She doesn't really know you well enough for a whole week." The girl I'd held as a baby didn't know me well enough. My attempts to stay connected became increasingly awkward. When I'd call to chat, conversations felt forced and rushed. When I'd share stories about my day or ask about theirs, I could hear the impatience in Michael's voice. "That's nice, Dad," became his standard response to everything, like he was humoring a child. The son who used to hang on my every word now couldn't wait to end our conversation. The gift-giving became another source of tension. Everything I bought was too much or unnecessary or the wrong style. The sweater was the wrong color. The books were too advanced. The toys were too loud. Jennifer would smile politely and exchange everything I bought Emma, making me feel like I couldn't do anything right. My love language had always been giving, but they made every gift feel like an intrusion. When I offered to help with Emma's college fund, Michael actually got angry. "We don't need your money, Dad. We're perfectly capable of providing for our daughter." The way he said "our daughter" felt like a wall going up, like I was an outsider trying to buy my way into their family. The money I'd saved to help my granddaughter was suddenly unwelcome charity. The final straw before the birthday disaster came when I drove up unannounced on a Saturday, something I'd done countless times when Michael was younger. Jennifer answered the door with barely concealed irritation. "Harold, you can't just show up like this. We have planned." Michael appeared behind her, not happy to see his father standing on his doorstep with a bag of Emma's favorite cookies. That day I realized I needed permission to visit my own son. Michael's 40th birthday party was supposed to be my redemption. I'd been planning it for weeks, choosing the perfect gift, a vintage Rolex that had belonged to his grandfather, my father. I'd had it restored, engraved with "From one generation to the next, with love." It cost me 3 months of grocery money, but I wanted to give him something meaningful, something that connected our family history. I arrived at their house in my best suit, heart full of hope that maybe this milestone birthday would remind Michael of what family meant. The house was full of his colleagues and neighbors. people I'd never met despite years of wanting to be part of his life. Jennifer greeted me with surprise, clearly not expecting me. "Harold, I didn't know you were coming." Michael didn't mention. I found Michael holding court in the living room, surrounded by friends from his office, telling stories about his latest business triumph. When he saw me standing in the doorway with my carefully wrapped gift, his smile faltered for just a moment. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Not "how nice to see you" or "thanks for coming," just confusion about my presence at my own son's birthday party. "I wanted to celebrate your birthday with you, son," I said, extending the gift box with shaking hands. "This was your grandfather. I thought you should have it now that you're 40. The room fell silent as Michael reluctantly took the box, his friends watching this awkward family drama unfold. I could see the embarrassment in his eyes, like I was a problem that had shown up uninvited. He opened the box without enthusiasm, barely glancing at the restored watch before closing it again. No appreciation for the months I'd spent saving for the restoration. No recognition of the family significance. No acknowledgement of the love behind the gesture. Just a polite thanks that felt like dismissal. His friends were getting restless, wanting to return to their party conversation. That's when I made my fatal mistake. I tried to explain the watch's history, how his grandfather had worn it to work every day for 30 years, how I'd saved it all these years hoping to pass it down. Michael cut me off mid-sentence with words that still echo in my nightmares. "Dad, honestly, the best gift would be if you just left my life. You're always trying too hard, showing up uninvited, making everything about you." The room went dead silent. I could feel every eye on me, watching the old man get rejected by his own son on his birthday. Jennifer looked mortified, but said nothing. Emma, who'd been playing nearby, stopped and stared. Michael's friends suddenly found their drinks very interesting, avoiding eye contact with the family drama they were witnessing. The humiliation burned through me like fire. "I see," I said quietly, putting the gift box on the coffee table where it sat, like evidence of my unwanted love. "I understand perfectly." I walked to the door with as much dignity as I could muster, while my heart was shattering into pieces. Nobody followed me. Nobody called my name. I drove home in silence, crying for the first time since Martha's funeral. The first week after the birthday party was the darkest of my life. I sat in my empty house, staring at the phone that never rang, waiting for an apology that never came. Maybe Michael would realize how cruel his words had been. Maybe he'd call to explain that he was drunk, stressed, having a bad day. Maybe he'd remember that I was the only parent he had left. But the silence stretched on like a wound that wouldn't heal. I found myself driving past the cemetery where Martha was buried, talking to her headstone about our son. "I don't know where we went wrong, sweetheart," I'd whispered to the marble. I tried to be a good father, but somehow I became the enemy. The conversations with my dead wife became the only honest communication I had left. Even she couldn't answer back anymore. By the second week, something inside me shifted. If Michael wanted me gone from his life, then I'd give him exactly what he asked for. But I wouldn't just fade away quietly in the same town, becoming a reminder of his cruelty every time someone mentioned Harold Collins. No, I'd disappear completely, start fresh somewhere nobody knew my story or my shame. I put the house up for sale within a month. 40 years of memories packed into boxes. 40 years of being Michael's father reduced to what would fit in a moving truck. The realtor was surprised by my urgency. "Most seniors prefer to take their time with such big decisions," she said. But I wasn't most seniors. I was a man with nothing left to lose and everything to rebuild. The hardest part was sorting through Michael's childhood things, his baseball trophies, school reports, Christmas ornaments he'd made in elementary school. Each item was a reminder of the boy who used to think I hung the moon, who ran to me with scraped knees and bad dreams. I packed it all away, unable to throw it out, but unable to keep looking at evidence of love that had died somewhere along the way. I chose Portland, Oregon, specifically because it was about as far from Ohio as I could get without leaving the country. A place where nobody knew Harold Collins, the rejected father, where I could just be Harold, the guy who played chess at the community center and bought coffee at George's Cafe every morning. A place where my story could start over at 72 years old. The move felt like dying and being reborn simultaneously. Loading the truck, I left behind not just a house, but an entire identity. I wasn't Michael's father anymore because Michael didn't want a father. I wasn't Emma's grandfather because Emma barely knew me. I was just Harold, a man with enough years left to build something new from the wreckage of his old life. The freedom felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. Portland welcomed me like a warm embrace I hadn't expected at 72. The small apartment I rented near Mount Tabor became my sanctuary, decorated with nothing from my old life except Martha's photo and my father's tool. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself instead of waiting for phone calls or planning visits that weren't wanted. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. George's Cafe became my morning routine. George Martinez, the owner, was a retired teacher who had moved to Portland for the same reason I had, to start over after life knocked him down. We bonded over chess and black coffee, sharing stories about second chances and the courage it takes to rebuild everything at our age. "You've got good energy, Harold," he'd say. "Whatever brought you here, you made the right choice." The chess club at the community center changed everything. Frank Rodriguez, a retired machinist with a wicked sense of humor, became my closest friend. We'd play for hours, talking about everything except the past we'd both left behind. Frank never asked why a man my age had moved across the country alone, and I never asked why he'd done the same. Some friendships are built on understanding without explanation. Betty Thompson appeared in my life like sunshine after a long winter. She was volunteering at the library when I stopped in looking for books about chess strategy. 78 years old, with silver hair and eyes that sparkled when she laughed. She'd been a nurse for 40 years before retiring to pursue her love of gardening and terrible romantic novels. Our first coffee date lasted 4 hours and felt like coming home. The community I'd stumbled into became the family I'd never expected to find. Tuesday chess tournaments with Frank and the guys. Thursday dinners at Betty's house where she'd cook enough food for an army. Weekend trips to the farmer's market where George would save us the best coffee beans. These people chose to include me not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. The difference was revolutionary. When Betty introduced me to her book club as my Harold, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, belonging without having to earn it. These women in their 60s and 70s welcomed me into their circle, arguing with me about plot twists and character development like I'd always been part of their group. They saw value in my opinions, laughed at my jokes, and made me feel intelligent and interesting again. A year into my new life, I realized I'd stopped checking my phone obsessively. The phantom pain of waiting for Michael's call had finally healed. I was sleeping better, eating better, laughing more than I had in the last decade of trying to maintain a relationship that had become a source of constant rejection. Portland hadn't just given me a new address, it had given me back my self-worth. The watch still sat in my dresser drawer, unwrapped and unworn. Sometimes I'd hold it and remember the hope I'd felt walking into that birthday party. But the bitterness had faded, replaced by something I never expected: gratitude. Michael's cruel words had set me free to discover that my worth wasn't determined by his acceptance. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened. 3 months ago, Frank burst into George's cafe with his phone in his hand, excitement written all over his face. "Harold, you need to see this," he said, pulling up a Facebook post from someone trying to locate Harold Collins. Originally from Ohio, father of Michael Collins, grandfather of Emma. The post was desperate, pleading, offering a reward for any information about my whereabouts. My son was looking for the father he'd told to leave his life. I stared at the screen, reading the details of Michael's current situation. Divorced from Jennifer, who'd taken Emma and moved to California. His business had failed spectacularly, leaving him bankrupt and facing lawsuits. A heart attack at 43 had left him alone in a hospital room with no emergency contact because he'd burned every bridge that mattered. The man who'd had everything had lost it all, and now he wanted his daddy back. Betty took my hand across the cafe table, her eyes full of concern. "What do you want to do, honey?" she asked gently. The question hung in the air like a choice between my old life and my new one. Frank and George gathered around, these men who'd become my chosen family, ready to support whatever decision I made. A contrast wasn't lost on me. People who'd known me for 3 years, caring more about my well-being than the son I'd raised for 40. I thought about the Harold who'd driven to that birthday party, with hope in his heart and a family heirloom in his hand. That man had been desperate for crumbs of affection from someone who saw him as a burden. This Harold, sitting in a cafe surrounded by friends who chose to love him, had learned the difference between being wanted and being needed. Michael needed me now, but he'd never actually wanted me. "I think," I said slowly, "that sometimes the best gift really is learning to stay away." Frank nodded approvingly. George squeezed my shoulder. Betty smiled with the wisdom of someone who'd also learned that love shouldn't have to beg for acceptance. I deleted the post without responding and ordered another round of coffee for my real family, the one I'd built from scratch at 72. That evening I did write a letter, not to Michael, but to Emma, now 17, and probably wondering about the grandfather who'd vanished from her life. I told her about Portland, about Betty and Frank and George, about the chess tournaments and book clubs and farmers markets. I told her that when she turned 18, if she wanted to know me as a person rather than an obligation, my door would always be open, but I wouldn't chase anyone anymore. Michael got exactly what he asked for that night 5 years ago, a father who left his life completely. The difference is, I didn't just leave his life, I built a better one without him in it. Sometimes the cruelest words become the kindest gift, even if it takes years to unwrap them properly. Tell me something, friend. Have you ever been told you weren't wanted by someone you love? Have you ever had to choose between being needed and being valued? Drop me a comment below. I'd love to hear how you handled walking away from love that hurt more than it healed. And if this story reminded you that it's never too late to start over, that family is what you make it rather than what you're born into, go ahead and subscribe to Grandpa's Diaries. I've got more stories about second chances, chosen families, and the courage it takes to rebuild your life when everything falls apart. Sometimes the best revenge is living well without the people who didn't appreciate you.